My guest today is Igor Kufayev, an artist, Advaita Tantra master, and founder of the Flowing Wakefulness community. For over a decade, Igor Kufayev has been serving as a conduit of transmission for awakening towards the new era of heart-centered consciousness. Speaking from direct realization of oneness, he inspires all seekers of truth to recognize the fullest potential present in human birth. Many have been touched by grace and awakened in his presence as he continues working towards building a global community to serve as a container for exploring possibilities for alternative consciousness-based culture. His involvement with sacred tradition expresses itself not only in scriptural exposition and metaphysical discourse, but also as non-intellectual, heart-based illumination. Though his methods are rooted in Shiva Tantra, Igor remains elusive to categorization, maintaining that tradition is not a set of esoteric teachings and techniques, but a vibrant field of energy enlivened in the hearts of those who go through this transformative process firsthand and bring these teachings to life. Traveling extensively with the programs mainly offered in North America and Europe, Igor currently resides in Mallorca, Spain. He lives with his partner, Amrita Ma Devi, and their two children, daughter Ramana and son Kianu. Vamadeva, from Sanskrit, the preserving aspect of Shiva in his peaceful, graceful, and poetic form, is Igor's spiritual name. So hello, Igor. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Hello, Jacob. It's lovely to be here with you.
It's really a pleasure to talk to you. I've been enjoying listening to podcasts that you've been interviewed on and also reading some of the interviews and written work that you've done, and it's been really beautiful. As someone who is also a follower of the Shiva Tantra path, it's always wonderful to meet a new teacher. So I'm excited to talk to you today. So to get started, I just wanted to, as I was listening to the Buddha in the Gas Pump podcast, you go to great lengths to talk about your personal story and what and the various steps along your path that led you to this work. And so, I would direct anybody, obviously, to that podcast as a great resource for learning more about you and that story. But I was wondering if you could maybe give us a little bit of the abridged version of that, and specifically, you talk a lot about in that interview about how you had these experiences, but of course you didn't have any vocabulary to talk about them. And then, over time, you found the tantric teachings. So I'd love to hear that story of how you went from this kind of vocabulary-less experience or experiences of illumination, and then how you sort of discovered and moved into this more tantric understanding that maybe added a new layer of that experience for you.
Sure. Well, I was hoping that we can somehow avoid going into the biographical details, but I guess this is unavoidable. So I'll try to be as concise as possible. It's actually not uncommon among those who have claimed that they had major breakthroughs in any way, from major shift in consciousness to transformation, that upon and shortly after that shift, there were also very interesting memories where in fact we knew ourselves to be just that. And these memories very often belong to the earlier phase of our lives. Some of them could be in our childhood, some of them could be in our teenage years, or if that happens in someone's life later on, these moments of being essentially tuned or in sync with the entire pace of creation, poetically expressed very often by those verses we admire, whether this is from Rumi, Hafiz, or speaking of Sufi literature, if we bring someone like Yeats or some of the English classics of those who have been, like, even you can read that in the early poetry of Keats, that connectedness, let alone William Blake. This kind of references to the childhood, references to the moments when we knew ourselves as this present moment. So I would like to take this opportunity, rather than recycling what I have already done many times, and Buddha the Cast interview is not the only one. There are conscious TV interviews, and there are other radio interviews where I have spoken in great depth about biographical details of where I grew up and how and so forth, and my career as an artist and so forth. Interest in lives, all the ups and downs, the tragedies that inevitably were faced, along with glory of being alive. What I'd like to perhaps bring is that additional element that realization brings about a very interesting moment that everything was indeed that. So in other words, it's not an additionally added kind of realization. It's not an additionally added level of consciousness. I hope we can speak later on about different, let's say, experiences that characterized these breakthroughs. But one very significant realization is that actually we do know ourselves. I would even emphasize that there is not a single living being, if he or she is conscious, does not know that connectedness. But what perhaps escapes us here is that the rarity of that experience, or perhaps the fragmented nature of otherwise our mundane experience, this waking, dreaming, deep sleep, where consciousness collapses and breaks down, so the continuity is broken down. And we accept that as a matter of fact, and we accept that as our reality. So those moments when we are tapped into this flow simply perhaps go unnoticed, if you see what I mean.
Yeah. Well, how could they not go unnoticed if, you know, if we're only able to kind of navigate them or understand them with the given categories that we have available to us? And if this experience, as you're describing, is sort of beyond categories, correct? If it's you know, we use this familiar term non-dual, then there would be a sense in which, I've always been curious about this, it's like, how can that which is beyond categories actually be describable within categories? And so then, as you're saying, there's this kind of poetic attempt to kind of describe or distill, you know, what is experienced in that space. But could you go into a little bit? I liked what you said about how we know, you know, that every living being knows this connectedness. But what kind of a knowledge is this? Are you talking about this is like an intuitive knowledge that's somehow smothered by our contractedness? And is it something that percolates up into our experience at a variety of different times? I mean, what is the nature of that knowing that you're talking about?
Intuitive knowledge comes later on. What I'd rather emphasize here is that the paradoxical nature of all experiences, paradoxical nature of being alive, is that there is no such thing as total ignorance. In fact, whether we look into Tantric lore or whether we look into the Vedantic traditions, the avidya, Sanskrit terms which stands for simply not knowing, ignorance, is, as it were, non-existent. There is no such thing. We cannot categorize that which does not exist. Avidya is a misperception. If we misperceived something, it doesn't mean that it had a presence prior to our misperception. If we misperceived a shadow for a dino or for a tiger, it doesn't mean that that shadow was a monster, right? It's just like appeared as. So the nature of avidya does not have reality at its basis. And this is very clearly been dealt in certain scriptures, like the most notoriously in Brahma Sutras, which gave a qualitative platform for someone like Adi Shankara to build or to evaluate his Advaita Vedanta. We know that historically Advaita Vedanta gains a new ground through the expositions and the teachings of Adi Shankara, the 8th century sage. And it is upon the Brahma Sutras that he built this, where the avidya itself, like the realization is gained through avidya. In other words, the vidya or ignorance essentially here has its purpose. But I'd like to put a bookmark here and go back to where you kind of directed the discourse and directed this conversation, is that I would like to add even more to these experiences that are available to all of us at some point, and they go unnoticed. We can even now give a more precise examples or more delicate examples that the state of unity is here at all times. And this is where, again, Tantric tradition draws its rich area of methodology. For example, we know very well that a repose between the incoming and outgoing breath, that point of suspension, is where the thought cannot enter. But it is so short, it is simply goes unnoticed. When the air draws in, when we inhale, there's a point of suspense. And then when we exhale, there's a point of suspense again. And these points are recognized in Tantra as extremely important. They have a name, they have a significance, and the methodology arises that the attention, the awareness is being essentially directed at these points. They are also called as points of juncture. At these points of juncture, there's nothing. It's, if you will, if we kind of try to use an analogy here, it's like an acupressure point. It's the point where consciousness becomes matter, if you will, where the connection between consciousness, awareness, and what we call matter is unperturbed. And these points are not just the point that I referred to now. These points also are observable in nature. The point at sunrise, at the sunset. These points, these essentially points of juncture, are extremely important, and many tantric scriptures emphasize these points. They are called points in between. My own teacher, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, used to say that everything is in the gaps. Everything is in the gaps. Of course, these are the cornerstones of Vedic knowledge. Everything is in the gaps. In the gaps between what? It's in the gaps between the sounds. When the sound collapses, there is a gap. And in that gap, all the laws of nature are in molten state of pure potentiality. So in other words, what am I trying to say here, what I'm trying to build up on here, is that unity is here at all times, if only our attention was more refined.
Right, which is a different teaching than the idea that unity is like in the linear future where I'm going to experience some enlightenment sometime later, and it's sort of a transcendent experience where I go outside the world. This is more of an imminent experience. Is that a good way to describe it? And it's always the most intimate thing that there is, and yet I'm thinking of the Pratyabhijna teachings that it's it's like it's not a kind of other thing, but rather recognizing that it was something that was there all along. Is it something like this?
That's a good start at it. I would say that sure, in the doctrines such as you've mentioned, the Pratyabhijna Hridayam, that direct recognition in the heart is very much based on bringing the refinement of attention to single-pointedness, where that attention is never broken. But at some point, of course, it's full of amazing revelations that we realize that this reality is here at all times. That reality, as when you were building your question, that this whole notion that somehow we will be able to break free from this imposition, from this essentially else called contracted state of awareness, or this ignorance or this not knowing or this what have you. And of course, we don't want to scare it here too lightly, because we would need to go back then and see what is in fact then abstracting consciousness from itself.
Yeah.
But to add, I'd like to also mention that many teachings precisely, and many teachers precisely do that when they are in the presence of those who have been treading the path for quite a while. The first thing they need to do is to break that very cozy, very comfortable expectation that one day this will happen. And it's a probing. My only reservations to this method is when that is the only method hammered. Because in Tantra, and as far as I understood, because don't forget, footnote, I checked you out as well, so I've listened to a couple of interviews,
okay.
Quite few of them, so and I'm also prepared a little bit.
Perfect.
Not entirely, haven't done my homework, but
I'm honored that you listened to them.
Sure, no, I had to. I wanted to hear your voice. I wanted to hear the angle of questions, and I was, without any kind of back scratching here in return, really, really was impressed by the emphasis that you do, and also your ability to take the interviewer, the one who is being interviewed, to the area maybe where the interviewer wasn't prepared to go, which is a very, very, very good, and I hope you're going to do it here. So I've noticed that you have a healthy interest, and I could feel it's on the rise towards tantric teaching itself. And as you know and have heard, and I'm sure many listeners here do as well, that Tantra is rich in expositions. Tantra is rich in methodology, and there are distinctive means, upayas they're called in Tantra, means. Yeah. In other words, different strokes for different folks. Mm-hmm. It's like what will work for someone may not necessarily work for another, and whose level of consciousness is refined enough, and there's enough of that refinement, very little is needed, just that little touch, a reminder, that very, very infinitesimally subtle pointer would do just that. Mm-hmm. With someone else, a lot of real kind of like tools, oriented work is needed, and nothing wrong with that either. So if we only adopt that hammering, that highest means, that at no time we were ever anything other than our own selves. Mm-hmm. And if that does not hold, if it only creates yet another conceptual understanding, right, no matter how profound that understanding, it's not serving. Mm-hmm. It's crystallizing in understanding, but I'm not experiencing it. It's a sincere seeker will say, well, I love that, I hear you, but I'm not experiencing it.
Yeah.
So the teacher will then lower the plank, go down, okay, let's try from here. Okay, let's see how this works. This doesn't work as well. Okay, what about here? Mm. This is where the skills come in action, essentially.
So that's interesting. So what you're saying then is that the crystallization of understanding, which can actually obstruct the process of realization. Is that what you're saying? So, and I find that interesting because from what I see in the Shaiva Tantra tradition is that it's a conceptually rich tradition. I mean, there's many traditions obviously within it, and there are many ways of looking at, this absolute reality, but it overflows with these kinds of maps. And so, sometimes I wonder, in what you're saying, like, is it tempting for those that are attracted? And I notice in myself, like, as an intellectually curious person, and that I've found that people who are attracted to Shaiva Tantra are very intellectually curious. There's a lot of smart people who are teaching in this tradition, and some scholars. And so I wonder if if you see there being, and I imagine that you do because you write about it even in the bio that I read, that there's a danger, or maybe danger is the wrong word, but there's a tendency to kind of let the experience be over-determined by the conceptual framework. And, and if that is the case, like, what are we to do? What's the next step to kind of break ourselves free from that desire to have it all mapped out and to assume that our experience is going to reflect the map?
Well, the answer to that is rather simple. that it simply requires sincerity. It simply requires sincerity, and one doesn't need to admit it to anyone, but living from direct cognition is very different than living from a concept or even from a memory. There are many people who have gone through profound breakthroughs, and some have been equipped with enough confidence to step out and become these essentially instruments, at least in their understanding, that they are capable of leading others. But the test is not what one went through ever, yesterday or 10, 50 years ago, but where one is in and with no respect to time. In other words, up until it is memory, there is still some work. It belongs to the domain of what is still being perceived within this linearity of time and space. There are breakthroughs. Sincere seekers actually are plenty out there, and they come out sooner or later, and they look for an adept to clarify certain things. I don't know if it's for me to share this, but even in the world of non-duality, it is my experience, direct experience, when those people who already in a position to guide others, in other words, self-assumed position, they are out there teaching, offering retreats, seminars, certainly satsangs. And yet, when occasion rose, these people asked, I'm, for instance, having problem with sleep for 8 years of my life. Well, I'm having trouble with this, the energy doesn't let me rest. I'm exhausted. Who's your teacher? My teacher is so-and-so. My God, your teacher is a big name. Why don't you go to your teacher? Well, because my teacher cannot help me. Why am I saying that? I'm not just trying to wash laundry in public here. But it just essentially, it boils down to that sincerity of acknowledging where the process continues and where one works from framework of conceptual understanding, and one is simply in a stream of one's own awareness perpetually. And I respect tradition, and I respect those teachers who have this audacity, this courage. It's not easy to go out and work in the field, let alone with the field. It requires a lot. What rather concerns me here is that in the day and age when this quest for liberation becomes essentially now is no longer a domain of a few chosen ones. It's out there. It's loomingly out there. But we speak about it in terms of how New Age speaks about it. We have entered this auxiliary age, this great portal. The shift in paradigm is imminent, and we all take part in that. There is a lot of truth in that, of course. We can speculate whether our time is more special than any other time in history. It's another topic altogether. But there is also a danger that with this mass appeal to a deeper knowledge, to direct experience, there will be inevitably more people out there doing this work. And if these people are not rooted and not coming from this essentially what is the main prerequisite, where the teaching has to be alive in the veins, as it were, then the teaching will inevitably take form of a conceptual discourse. Some are better, others are some are more eloquent at that, others are not. But one way or the other, seasoned seeker will be able to perceive that sooner or later, hopefully sooner.
Yeah, well, I mean, sorry to interrupt, but what I hear you saying, I feel like is really interesting, because not only, do I feel like what you're saying is true about the conceptual system elaborating around things that become popular, but also, we are also in a consumer-driven culture, and so the more attractive something like this becomes in the mainstream, the more likely it is to be branded. I mean, we're already seeing that in the yoga community in general, so there's this artificial, and opportunistic relationship that people have toward these teachings, because it's like, oh, this is the way that I'm going to make my living, because more people are interested in it. So people are going to rise up who see the opportunity to become teachers and to have followings and whatever. So I'd love your thoughts on that. How I don't know how we are to kind of discern in our own practice between the authentic, teachings or teachers and these ones that are maybe more inclined or more inspired by the consumer-driven narrative that is always sort of, accompanying anything that's becoming mainstream.
Well, it's not as simple. And at the same time, there is already a self-selective process in place. We can look at it from a more analytical perspective, kind of in retrospect, or we can look at it also from the perspective of why certain people attracted to certain teachers and certain teachings and certain methodologies. That in itself is very telling, simply because likes attracts likes. And not that none of us are reassured from making, as it were, perhaps less smart choices. Sometimes we go with a lot of what essentially clouds our perception. And I'd like to say that out loud, that the more charismatic the teacher is, the more danger that teacher will attract the following. And I'm saying that fully aware that many people consider myself to be such a teacher. I'm fully aware that there is a lot of, if you will, facade that can really abstract one from a proper judgment, which is required here before that plugging in, before that process of connecting to someone, to steadfast, to reassure that there will be a transmission, because I come from the understanding, experience, and tradition where this transmission is an indispensable part. It's the part. The teaching is not about what we understand. Sometimes people come and they don't speak English well enough, and yet they receive transmission through a sheer sound, being in the presence, being in that field. And one left to wonder, why did I bother to go for, So there is kind of, we can break this into a delta of various topics we can go from here. But in response to what you've asked, I think it's like literally there is this already certain streams that direct us. If someone is going for a certain prepackaged, kind of easy to grasp and very, very applicable, in a sense, ready-made, I would also add, perspective on this, then that also quite indicative of their level of maturity, their level of development. And it doesn't matter how young, it doesn't matter how senior, how mature. Age makes very little difference. My experience that some of the young people of our time, they like, I don't know, they're like already sages in the making. You know, there's so much maturity in this 20-year-old, in that 25-year-old. And yet other people like have been here for a while and have already enough experiences, and it seems like still kind of going around the circles when it comes to certain understanding, when it comes to this, where to choose to drink to quench the thirst, where to partake. So in a non-duality scene, which I'm sure you're aware of fully, it's a talk of the town, isn't it? It's this very appeal that already enlightenment is a bogus, that there is no such thing as enlightenment, because the individual soul is it's not something which has a stance of its own.
Yeah.
So how can individual soul get enlightenment in the first place? Mm-hmm. So all there is this light or luminosity of awareness. And this is very, very liberating to hear that. It's very inspiring to hear that. Of course, the satsang movement is a very beautiful movement. However, it should be immediately restated that yes, being is given. We don't need to work at it. Yet this is a process.
Yeah.
It's a process. It's not the alchemy, the metamorphosis is a process.
Yeah.
And if we accept this, that already everyone is enlightened because all there is light of consciousness that illumines everything within and without, then that will be just that, a mental modification, yet another vritti, yet another thought.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's what you're saying is really interesting. I want to go back to something that you had said about transmission, because I was really I really enjoyed reading in this, I think it was a Yoga Actual interview that you did, written interview, where you were talking about transmission in response to a question about the guru-disciple or teacher-student relationship, because as this other interviewer had, pointed out, this has become a very often criticized. I know, a number of people who are very much against or don't think that it works in the West and all of this stuff about it. And I really enjoyed how you talked about the transmission as being more than something. It's more than simply a skill set, right? It's just not that you're learning these specific practices to do. There's also, you say, an attitude, which is more than simply learning a technique, I think was how you put it. So would you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that's a really beautiful way to think that there's a transmission of an attitude taking place between a teacher and a student that is beyond the discursive goings on, right? It's not just a kind of intellectual engagement, right?
Well, it encompasses in itself absolutely everything, and leaves nothing. The term guru shishya parampara, the kind of teacher-student continuation, this continuity of the teacher-student is really. If we only view this from the perspective of someone who is in a position to impart certain, even if it's most sacred, knowledge to another party, mm-hmm. then we already there and then missing the whole point. Let us maybe view it from slightly different perspective. There are understandings which are becoming more and more prevalent today, where most advanced, or at least most avant-garde quantum science is literally rubbing shoulders or holding hands with the understandings that we can find in many non-dual teachings of the past. And that is that which essentially instruct us that there is no such thing as the reality of out there, as opposed to in here. In other words, the world is as you see it, which was the leitmotif of the Yoga Vashishta, the very central line which runs as a red thread across this whole entire scripture, Vashishta Yoga, that the world is as you see it. This brings very, very pertinent points that reality or relationship between subject and object, it's not what we think. Of course, it is our experience, and this is the marvel of this Maya. This is the marvel of this, what appears, which is not what it seems, which appears to be in the way it appears to be. So if we view this perspective of teacher-student relationship as this ultimate subject-object relationship, that we are in for some revelations. We are possibly here in for some very significant revelations which perhaps could help us to rehabilitate that relationship, because it's an ongoing dilemma. We all are facing it now in our postmodern age, where this relationship has undergone some violation on both parts and undergone some essentially perhaps necessary shake-up. It is for us to reevaluate this, because as I like very much what in one of your interviews you said, we cannot throw the baby with the water. This, or the baby with the
bathwater,
bathwater. It's not about what the teacher can do for the student, but if we understand that at some point this subject and object relationship need to enter a very subtle phase where it can be refined further. And we can see this possibility in the guru-shishya or teacher-student relationship present all throughout. In other words, when the questions were asked some of the masters of the past about the possibility of recognizing one's guru, and the many responses were quite in agreement, irrespective of where this teacher comes, which this teacher belongs to this tradition, is that is nearly impossible, because the recognition will be only relevant to one's level of consciousness. You cannot recognize anything other than your own self in the other. This is the relationship between subject and object. The value of our experience, whatever someone who is in a balanced state, someone who is, let's say, in a state of equilibrium and in a beautiful part of the world and not necessarily is burdened with tasks, walking, let's say, somewhere on a beach in Goa in a sunset, the whole world is an oyster at this moment. And someone who is going through a torment, walking on the same beach, to him, maybe this place is at the moment will feel like a hell. So, and everything in between, of course, this. It just tells us there is no such thing as an objective reality. There is no objective reality. Everything that we experience, essentially, is influenced and colored by the subjectivity of that experience. And it is that subjectivity of our experience what colors that relationship. Therefore, when my own students come to me, sincerely, those who really, really go through a difficult time of commitment, the first thing I do is to tell them that this is a good process. Don't discard that. What you're going through now is a very healthy process, because it is through this reevaluation. There's no such thing, because it's not based on faith. It's no one is asking you to give your life and just on the account of faith that someone will be able to guide you. These are very serious matters that we often expect from spiritual teachers, what we would not ever dream to expect from anyone else. Let's face it also. In our community, and we do as much as we can as a community, we even, I'll just break it, we began the campaign 2 years ago. Campaign aimed at rehabilitation of that teacher-student relationship in terms of how it is understood now in this gradually globalized culture.
Yeah.
The Western culture, I don't think even it makes any difference now to say Western, because really globalization removes these boundaries now.
Yeah.
You can be in Japan or China and have the same dilemma.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
So really, it's that subject-object subtlety and impossibility of knowing other than through the faculties of essentially how refined are these faculties, and these faculties are refined by nothing other than our own awareness, our own consciousness. So it is where our consciousness is. I know it from myself that I did not recognize the value in Guru until I actually have experienced major shift in awareness. Before that, it was, everything. All the fight went into it.
And what was the character? Do you want to talk a little bit about that shift in awareness? Like, what was the character of that shift that made you receptive to that?
I have to confess here, maybe it might disappoint some listeners, that
No.
You never know, because I cannot speak about it with this laser sharp or sword-like sharp discrimination, because it happened to me from a place of from that very molten place of simply being bathed by that love which was born out of recognition, which I can't even begin to put into words in terms of what happened prior to that and what led to that and why. It's just simply, yes, there was some, it's not non-linear at all. The whole thing is like there's a whole storyline, obviously, but the experience itself is, if I were to use the Sanskrit term bhava, that feeling, that
mood,
that mood, exactly, that particular mood was all steeped in more feeling oriented, or coming from the feeling rather than from the intellect. The intellect no longer was able to fight. It simply surrendered. It simply laid the arms down. It laid the armor down. And that was a really disarming moment of surrender, which then unfolded into profound phase of being completely, which turned me into, cooked pie. It was like mushed, totally.
Pie.
Yeah. So it's just I cannot compare it with anything. It's just waves upon waves upon waves of feeling, which I understood what devotion is. I understood that devotion is not something one can teach. It cannot be taught. It simply rises out of that where consciousness itself finds itself at some point.
I don't think that's a disappointing answer at all. In fact, I think that's a really beautiful answer, because you're sort of touching a little bit or expressing something a little differently that we explored earlier, which is that these experiences don't necessarily arise in this linear way. And I think that's refreshing for people to hear, because a lot of people, the way that enlightenment or experiences of awakening are often described as in this very like punctuated way. You know, I was sitting at my table, I had this explosive feeling and blah, 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 and all this happened. And maybe it happens that way for some people, but, you know, but I think a lot of people there's this almost this complex of envy that arises around that. You know, it's like, well, why don't I have those moments of punctuation? And so what I hear you saying is that it doesn't have to arise that way. You can't really describe it. It's not a linear thing, and yet it's very powerful and illuminating. So I think it's a beautiful answer.
Well, yeah, yes and no. I mean, what I mean by that, yes and no, is that, funny enough, in relation to my own process, it was very intense. It was very dramatic.
Okay.
But where I chose to enter our exchanges here is to bring to our awareness the continuity in that uninterrupted unity, which is there at all times.
Yeah.
And in addition to that, it is only upon this major sweep, if you will, through when essentially there was total incineration, what in certain traditions spoken of as this annihilation, incineration took place, because the consciousness, because it was remained conscious at all times, illumined by the light of its own luminosity, when all this corporal reality was simply dissolved in the light of its own awareness. Only when this became a predominant, even through a phase in time experience, I was able to glance back and recognize all those, what Osho used to call satoris, like some other teachers, you know, those mini illuminations.
Yeah.
And I was amazed how many of those were prior to that. In the studio as an artist, losing myself in that act of painting, where suddenly that subject and object cease to exist, and it's just a pure flow.
Yeah.
And of course, I've had dancers speaking about that. I've had musicians speaking about that.
Yeah.
I've had guys who were at it, at something really intensely, speak about that.
Yeah.
So, one very, very telling experience was simply one really hot summer in London, when I was going through a very rather traumatic experience of separation. And I just rose up. I was at someone's apartment. It was this very real painful transition. I was quite young. I just sat up in bed in these bay French windows and this warm rain outside. And I sat and wept there by a sheer fact that I found myself alive. It was just this pure, what I would now call moment of very intimate connection to this moment of being, where that beingness was experienced irrespective of perhaps because of all these added stresses otherwise. At some point it snagged. It could no longer, the nervous system could no longer hold this stress. So it gave way, it gave in. So I woke up, literally my body was jumped up. I sat, I looked outside these open windows and this pouring rain and the sound, and I just felt the happiest man alive. Okay, I will wake up in the morning and I will have to smell the coffee of what I had to go through. But at that moment, none of that existed, you see?
Yeah.
And then, of course, in all this, in retrospect, our life is filled with these moments. Filled with these moments. This is why certain traditions which prefer to utilize more elusive dialogues and in their exposition, like Taoistic, let's say, perspective. Zen also has that element, and certainly Sufi tradition is never to speak about it, never to go trying to articulate it in the way, but rather through something else. Which, funny enough, Tantra is opposite to that. Tantra is it just stretch your bow and hit the target as close to that heart as you can, in terms of everything. It's very different. This is maybe why earlier you've asked that this interest towards Tantra in our days. I think we're coming to a very beautiful time of rehabilitation of Tantra, where this kind of misconceptions and misperceptions are hopefully will be behind us.
Yeah.
And the right people will begin to consider this path as a very exciting path, filled with very rare possibilities, which perhaps not so present in other methodologies.
Yeah. So what do you think, that's interesting you bring up the pointedness. I've never heard anyone describe it like that, the pointedness of Tantra versus traditions like Zen or Taoism. When are you speaking of things like, the Zen cone, where it's like you're entering that emptiness through a kind of paradox, like a paradoxical tool? Is that what you mean when you say a roundabout way of getting to that place? Is that what you're describing?
Well, without being afraid to generalize, and we'll allow ourselves a little bit maybe to bring it in a moment to show that Tantra also has that element at its perhaps highest, most refined expositions. But yes, what I mean also here is that additional element of artistry that Zen is so known for. The additional element, artistry here, in a sense that artfulness. So in other words, it's not just about grokking it, but it has this, I would say, Zen-like beautiful ways of how to cut through, disarming. I mean, the whole culture of Zen is found on extremely refined concepts that came obviously from India through China. It's that dhyana versus Chan versus Zen. It's the same as the etymology of transformation of the same term. Zen is the culture of meditation, but it gets this additional value by the time it reaches its refinement in Japan, which some scholars consider also. That's where the decadence of the teaching took place. The different perspectives. Yeah. That the emphasis was more on the form. How what you dress in, how you sit, the place that built for it. It's like it's so also meticulous. It's so demanding. I'm very often taking Mickey out of it in my own immersions, my own retreats, so that to loosen up people's attention to, let's say, that what could be considered as an entourage. But for some people, this is so attractive. But to me, what's interesting in particular approaches in Zen is that unexpected element, like the artist way, or the way of the tea master. You see, it's being able to improvise. It's in the improvisation. You can set everything, but then the tea master comes and, and throws a bit of dust here and breaks something because the lines are too straight, too symmetrical. We need to bend here something, And it's kind of like reminding us constantly of that embrace of the permanence and impermanence and dance that what Zen is also is that fusion of Buddhist ideals carried into China by Bodhidharma, with which was richly infused, or rather which was infused with the very rich Taoistic traditions. And that, of course, this is a unique gift. So that non-linearity here, that you mentioned the koan, it's only one aspect. There are many aspects. The passage, the transmission itself in Zen is very peculiar. The Zen stories are full of the stories about the spiritual fools, right? The same like in Sufi, like the scholar versus the, that kind of holy fool from the south, who in the end gets it all. Yeah. Without trying. He's washing the dishes, he's outside chopping wood, carries water, rides the donkey, right? The scholar is like there, sitting in the class, reciting everything, wearing nice robes, but in the end, the mantle goes to the one who was doing seemingly mundane tasks, right? Yeah. And these stories obviously are there to teach us something, to show us something, the paradoxical nature of it all.
Yeah.
And so,
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, and so though I did say that tantric tradition is very precise. What I meant by that is very precise in the way that it dealt with the spiritual anatomy, the term that I use very often for the anatomy of the process, which of course incorporates and includes all this, what we know today about the pathways, the pranic pathways. The highway to God, of course, is accompanied by this whole conglomerate of pranic pathways. It's a science in its own right. And there are many, many different accounts and schools left. Some consider them to be fragmented, and it's very difficult to make sense out of it. But therefore, this is where the role of the adepts come, to hold this all within themselves, because all this knowledge needs to be continuously verified, lived through. Otherwise, it will become just that. It will become just this encyclopedic, huge library. The true knowledge never burned and never drowned, right? Mm-hmm. We know that historically, mm-hmm. right? The Alexandrian library, though perished, knowledge survived. Arabs translated it, took it, and then passed it on to spare the Renaissance, because it's quite a beautiful analogy here, how Shakti makes sure that it will save that knowledge in the heart of the sincere or the eager adept, and that knowledge will be passed on. And otherwise we'll lament, oh my God, we lost all these works of great Greek philosophers of pre-Socratic era, where all this glory, oh no, apparently, here it is resurfaced. Yeah. Through the work of Plotinus, So there is so many different ways of how this process is reassured. But above all else, through the heartbeat of those who are alive and kicking now.
Yeah, I haven't felt that in so strong a way as I do. I've recently, or relatively recently, picked up chanting the Sri Rudram as a part of my practice. And I have these moments where I'm chanting it where I really feel that this isn't something that I elected to do. It's not something that I chose as a part of my practice. I experience it almost like the Shakti is preserving through my faculties. Preserving. My small tiny part is continuing the kind of aliveness of this tradition through my own personal practice. So, yeah, I love that idea of the Shakti. Moving the wisdom where it can be preserved based on the conditions of whatever's going on.
Completely. Now, what you're touching upon now is the real heart of all teachings is in the oral transmission. What does it mean in the oral transmission? Why oral transmission is so important? Oral here means vocalized, and someone obviously partakes in that. Someone hears that. It has an additional value here. Oral traditions, essentially, we could argue, and we'll leave that to scholars, but we could perhaps speculate, I should say, that all ancient teachings were oral traditions for quite some time, until the necessity rose to pass them on or reassure that they will not die somehow, because maybe this conflict, that conflict, maybe because of certain teachings needed to go underground, maybe because of the situations, geopolitical situations in different parts of the world where this necessity rose, then these teachings began to be written down. Mm-hmm. We know that already, certainly the case when it comes to the traditions born in the Indian subcontinent. The Vedas were all recited. All Vedic sciences were recited, and recited from heart to heart, literally. So that when we partake in something which is spoken, or when we ourselves recite or vocalize something which is otherwise written, we bring this actually into that gross sphere of existence and enliven that existence with these sounds, as well as, if you will, refresh this out of that vantage point so that they have this possibility to be vocalized and heard. Now, you may recite it for yourself, so who will be the hearer here? Obviously that yourself. You partake in that. That suffices. Whether you are alone, in a company, with 100 people, with 10 people, or just for yourself, we can, of course, go from here, and we can go into a real subtlety of this, that it is for the sake of one who partakes tremendous joy in essentially experiencing these vibrations, even on a cellular level. In addition, there is this tantric understanding which belongs to the levels of speech. It's this knowledge of vak.
Yeah.
And it is this vak, which is essentially the most ancient term for Shakti, the most ancient term for Kundalini itself, that vak represents. And it's that what stands for the sound, for the word, for that sacred word. In the beginning there was a word, and so forth, right?
Yeah.
It's true to all traditions. In the beginning there was the sound, pure sound. Sound was emitted. And the emission of that sound is a perpetual affair. It's not something that was emitted at the time of the Big Bang.
Yeah.
And we're hearing the echo of that. Although at some point we nearly bought that. We're very excited that this could be the story of our universe. That we live actually in the byproduct of some explosion. Now there are other interesting possibilities are being entertained that actually never came into existence. Simply, it's perpetually comes into existence, perpetually being sustained, perpetually being reabsorbed.
Yeah.
And it is this is so fascinating. To me, this is really fascinating ground where, again, this ancient wisdom and most cutting-edge findings and breakthroughs in sciences are now closing the circle, that broken circle, that very important connection, because spirituality, as my teacher used to say, has to be verified through scientific knowledge. We cannot just live like taking it all on trust just because it was valid then. It has to be lived and be valid today. This perhaps is the only reason why sacred knowledge always need to be reevaluated for the necessity of time. And there will be always those who will come and reevaluate that knowledge for the necessity of time, because that's in the very nature of consciousness. So this is why that validity, that this, like people at some point might be so taken by euphoria that all this is available, internet, Google, schmoogle, right?
Google,
click finger, yeah, tip of the fingers, we've got it all.
Yeah.
We've got the most amazing access now to anything, any most obscure Sanskrit term, you've got it. You know, you want to learn Tantra on any level, you've got it. It's all out there. Anything, Kabbalah, there's no secrets left, as it were, right?
Yeah.
And yet, we live at the time when it's like it's still following that same kind of paradigm that we can all get it somehow by leapfrogging, somehow outsmarting this whole process. And this is quite happy for the opportunities like this even to speak about it, and that there is these attempts being made in many different corners now with the peers in this job to rehabilitate and kind of like the dust has to settle, no? The dust of all this euphoria, hype, you know, the way the 60s, the way the 70s, right? Then kind of all settled down a little bit, and now the non-duality is settling down now. And this is what I feel why the Tantra is on the rise and why Kashmir Shaivism is also, everyone wants to add it to their CV because it's just cool.